In this section, we explore how we can estimate our quality level. If quality is inversely proportional to variability, then variability of our process with respect to our upper specification limit or lower specification limit will give us an idea as to how far away from the border are we, or are we over the border. Now, as I said earlier, all manufacturing processes do not necessarily follow a normal distribution, but if you were to take the mean values of any distribution that they may be following and then plot the means, then the central mean tendency theorem comes into play and you do land up with a bell curve, a tail on the left and a tail on the right. Now, the mean value, the average value is given as mu. There's a mean value. And there's a dispersion or spread which is measured by what is called the standard error or the standard deviation. The variance is given as sigma square, and sigma square root of variance is the standard deviation. Now, if you can estimate the standard deviation of the distribution that you are working with, now, in this normal distribution, if you have the mean and if you have one standard deviation on the left and one standard deviation on the right, totally two standard deviations from the mean, 67% of the population is within this space under the curve, one standard deviation on either side, totally two standard deviations. If you take two standard deviations to the left and two standard deviations to the right, a total of 4 standard deviations under that curve, 95% of your population resides within this boundary. 2 standard deviations to the left, 2 standard deviations to the right. From the center, the mean. The mean is at the center of your distribution. Now, if you were to take 3 standard deviations to the left and 3 standard deviations to the right, a totality of 6 standard deviations, or what is called 6 sigma, then in a normal distribution, 99.73% of the population resides between the 6 sigma limits. That is 3 sigma to the left, 3 sigma to the right. In other words, 6 sigma, beyond the 6 sigma, 0.135% is on the left and 0.135% of the population is beyond 6 sigma. For all practical purposes, you can say 6 sigma represents the tips of the tail. The distance between the tail is 6 sigma for all practical purposes. 0.135% is outside there, 0.135% is outside here. But otherwise, the totality of the population, 99.73% of the population, lies within 6 sigma, 3 sigma to the left, 3 sigma to the right. Now, to be able to explain it to you easier, let us say the distance between the upper specification limit and the lower specification limit, that is the rail on the right side and the rail on the left side, is the distance between the rails. Upper specification limit minus lower specification limit represents the distance between the rails, and 6 sigma represents the distance between the tails, the right tail and the left tail. Now, process capability ratio is an index that tells you what is the dispersion or variance in your distribution. Is a measure. And since you are not talking in isolation of a distribution, but talking in the context of an upper specification limit and a lower specification limit, it gives you an idea about the dispersion vis-a-vis the upper specification limit and lower specification limit, the distance between the rails. Process capability ratio is defined as the distance between the rails divided by the distance between the tails. That is upper specification limit minus lower specification limit. That is the distance between the rails divided by 6 sigma, which is the distance between the right end of the tail and the left end of the tail. Upper specification limit minus lower specification limit divided by 6 sigma is your process capability ratio. If the distance between the rail, the numerator, is smaller than the distance between the tail, that is 6 sigma, the numerator is smaller than the denominator, process capability ratio is less than 1. Because part of the tail is outside the left rail, part of the tail is hanging outside the right rail. The distance between the tail exceeds the distance that is prescribed for you, that is upper specification limit minus lower specification limit. So, if the distance between the rails is less, the numerator is less, then the denominator, which is 6 sigma, the distance between the tails, your process capability ratio is less than 1. If the distance between the rails, the numerator, equals the distance between the tails, that is 6 sigma, that is the right tail is sitting on the right rail and the left tail is touching the left rail. So the tails are on the rails. So the numerator equals the denominator, the process capability ratio is 1. If the distance between the rails, as in the case of the Japanese transmission systems, is much more than the distance between the tails of the Japanese distribution, the numerator is more than the denominator, then you have a process capability ratio in excess of 1. 1.1, 1.5, 1.8, whatever. Now, if you do not have an upper specification limit and a lower specification, you have only either a lower specification limit or only an upper specification limit, then you have only half the distribution. Therefore, if it is upper specification limit, the mean has to be less than the upper specification limit because it should not go beyond the upper specification limit. So upper specification limit minus the mean divided by 3 sigma, because you are talking only half the distribution. Upper specification limit minus mean divided by 3 sigma gives you the process capability ratio of a one-sided distribution where there is only an upper specification limit. Now if you have a lower specification limit, the mean has to be more than the lower specification. It cannot be below that. So the mean minus lower specification limit divided by 3 sigma gives you an indication of what is the process capability ratio of the one-sided specification distribution that you have, where there's only a lower specification limit. Mean minus lower specification limit divided by 3 sigma. Now why are we discussing this? How does it help us? I had explained earlier about alpha errors and beta errors. Now in alpha error is a situation where the sample has come from under the tail but outside the rail. So if the process capability ratio is less than 1, there will always be some part of the tail outside the rail on the left side or on the right side or on both sides. And any sample that comes from under the tail but outside the rail will lead to batch reduction, regardless of whether it is any different from the earlier batch where it had passed. So if you do not want a situation where an alpha error is committed in your QC laboratory or sampling, then if the tail is on the rail, no part of the tail is outside the rail, either the left rail or the right rail, the tail is on the rail, any sample has to be under the tail or the distribution, but it will always be between the rails, therefore you will never have an alpha error. Please remember, I said 6 sigma represents 99.73% of the population, not 100% of the population. There's still 0.135% outside the rail here, there's still 0.135% outside. But for all practical purposes, for as long as the tails are on the rails, the sample has to necessarily come from between the rails, under the distribution, under the tails. Therefore, you will not have an alpha error problem. If now we have the tails coming inside the rails more and more, the more it is away from the rails, the lower is the possibility that any sample that you might ever draw will be outside the rails. Whatever you draw will be within the rails. you will never have this so-called alpha error or type 1 error. Now here is a table that tells you, depending on what is the process capability ratio of a process, what are the number of defectives. If it is a one-sided specification, then what are the limits? But if it is a two-sided specification, then what are the defectives per million? You can see over here that if the process capability ratio is 1, the tails are on the rails. I said 0.135% will be outside the rails. Therefore, the number of defectives produced, if it is a one-sided specification, is 1,350 per million. And if it is a two-sided specification, naturally, it is 2,700 defectives per million. If the process capability ratio is less than 1, let us say 0.7, then you have in a one-sided specification as many as 17,865 defectives per million, and in the case of two-sided specifications, 35,729. But if the process capability ratio increases beyond 1 and becomes higher and higher, goes up to let us say 1.5, in a one-sided specifications, you will be producing less than 4 defectives per million. And in the case of a two-sided specifications, you will be producing less than 7 defectives or non-conforming units per million. Of course, if you go to process capability ratios as high as 2, you will be producing almost no defectives per million, 0.0009 in case of a one-sided specification and 0.0018 per million of a two-sided specification. In other words, it's not talking about parts per million. If you were to talk about parts per billion, you're producing less than 2 defectives per billion. Now the recommendations from the regulatory agencies is that henceforth they will judge you not just on your validation documentation but also on the estimates of your process capability ratio. They would like for existing processes, if it is a non-sterile process and it's an existing process that is known to you, that you have worked with for years, the two-sided specifications case, the process capability ratio should be at least 1.33. If it is a one-sided specification, 1.25. But if it is a new process, it may be non-sterile, but it's a new process, unknown to you. Now, they want to make sure that new process has been tightened enough to establish a process capability ratio, if it is a two-sided specification, at the rate of 1.5, not 1.33. And if it is a one-sided specification, even if the process is non-sterile, it has to be 1.45. But if it is a sterile product or a biological product, even if it is an existing process, they want to see a demonstration that your process capability ratio, if it is a two-sided specification, should be 1.5, and if it is a one-sided specification, should be at least 1.45. And if the sterile process that you're talking about is something new for the first time, then they would like to see a process capability ratio of 1.67, and in the case of one-sided specification, 1.6. This is the minimum that they expect from your processes. So if we were to consider the Japanese transmission case study, the specification limit was 300 plus minus 3 mm, that is 303 mm to 297 mm. The upper specification limit minus lower specification limit was 6 mm. The American transmission systems were covering the full spectrum, 300 plus minus 3 mm. So they were operating more or less at a process capability ratio of 1. But the Japanese, they had internal, better, stricter controls, and it was 300 plus minus 1.5 mm. So it is 301.5 mm to 298.5 mm, a total spread of only 3 mm. Upper specification limit minus lower specification limit is 6 mm. Their spread or 6 sigma is only 3 mm. So you have 6 divided by 3. So they had a process capability ratio virtually of 2. And that's the reason why the warranty costs were low and the consumers found the use of the transmission a delight. Fine. Now, how do you estimate what is your process capability ratio? The right way to do it is to summon a qualified statistician and assign the responsibility to him. Because there are ever so many issues that I cannot cover in this presentation. The statistician will determine whether the batch records that you're placing before him are all poolable or not poolable. In other words, to use layman's language, whether you're comparing oranges with oranges or you're comparing oranges with apples. So this is a fairly technical assignment, and it would be best served by a qualified statistician. But if you don't have a statistician, don't have access to a statistician, but you still want to have some rough idea as to what is your quality level, what is your process capability, then you could do as I suggest. There's a thumb rule, but a reasonably reliable thumb rule. Now, if you have 2,000 records or 1,000 records, no big issue. But if you have only 10 records or 15 records or 20 records, then I suggest that you take all the records that are available with you. Now, please remember you have Excel, and Excel has built-in formulae for statistics, so it will tell you what is the mean, what is the standard deviation, or anything else of relevance to you. So it isn't as difficult as one would imagine otherwise. So whatever you do have, 15 records, 20 records, 30 records, analyze them, find out the means and find out the standard deviations. Plot all the means together. Now, in the plot of the means, find out what is the standard deviation. So now you know what is your Six Sigma, you know what your upper specification limit is, you know what your lower specification limit is, and now you have an estimate of your process capability ratio. If you have a large number of records, for example, more than 500 records, then you could pick 70 successive records, the most recent records, 70 of them, 70. Now, if there are any batch failures there, then if a failure investigation has been instituted and an assignable cause has been found, for example, it was an analyst error, or it was non-adherence to SOP, or it was power failure, some clear assignable cause, you can remove those. Because procedurally, you would exclude them anyway. They don't represent your normal practice. But if you had a failure for which the failure investigation was unable to unearth the cause, then you include it, because it could be an alpha error. If you take 70 records, you can make an assessment at 90% confidence level. If you are able to get 100 successive records, then your estimate could be as high as 95%. Now let us say you have analyzed 70 records and you have an upper specification. Let's say the parameter in question is very critical, and that is viscosity. The lower specification limit is 0.17, the upper specification limit is 0.18, 0.17, 0.18. Now you've taken as many records as you had and you analyze, and the mean turns out to be 0.176. And then you analyze what is the standard deviation of all the means that are there, and you find that it is 0.02. The upper specification limit is 0.18. The lower specification level is 0.17. So the upper specification limit minus lower specification limit, the distance between the rails is 0.1. The standard deviation is 0.02, 6 times the standard deviation is 0.12. So you have the numerator is 0.1 divided by the denominator is 0.12. So it's 0.1 upon 0.12. That means your process capability ratio is approximately around 0.8. Now, assuming you have done this and you have arrived at a certain process capability ratio. Now, you're doing it with 90% confidence. That means there is an error of 10%. It could be plus 10%, it could be minus 10%. Now, if you have estimated a process capability ratio of 1, and actually your process capability ratio is 1.1, then good for you. The patient is safer. But if you have estimated it as 1, and the actual process capability ratio is 0.9. You have overestimated your process capability ratio by 0.1. That could lead to a false sense of security. That cannot be tolerated. Therefore, whatever is the process capability ratio you arrive at based on samples, because you're not taking the whole population, you've taken only a small selected sample, and on that you're making your inferences. That inference could be right, that inference could be wrong. So, whatever is that value, you discount that by 10%. So if you have arrived at a process capability ratio of, let us say, 1, you discount 10% and say, for all practical purposes, I can say with 90% confidence that my process capability ratio is at least 0.9. Now, this is one aspect. Now that you know what is your process capability ratio, let's go to the next step. Now let's take a case where the process capability ratio of a distribution is actually 2 and the process is dead centered. Now the left hand tail is further in from the lower specification limit and the right hand tail is in from the upper specification limit, and the margin of safety is the same for both sides. This is called a centered process. Now, if the process starts drifting, let us say, towards the upper specification limit, the safety margin on the left-hand side keeps increasing, but the margin on the right-hand side starts decreasing. Therefore, you can no longer say your process capability ratio is 2, because from one side it has gone close to the border. It might drift to a point where the right tail is on the right rail, which is as good as saying your process capability ratio is only 1. Your actual process distribution may have a process capability ratio of 2. But because it is not centered and it has started drifting, now it has compromised your process capability ratio. So there is a new term called CPK, or process capability ratio real process capability ratio is upper specification limit minus mean divided by 3 sigma, or mean minus lower specification limit divided by 3 sigma. Whichever is lower, that is your real process capability ratio. So in the case where the distribution starts drifting and the tail touches either rail, your real process capability ratio is reduced to 1, no matter what the original process capability ratio may have been. And if now it drifts further and the tail gets over the rail, your process capability ratio in real terms is less than 1, even if the whole distribution is compact and has an overall process capability ratio of 2. The real process capability ratio available to you and your product and your process is less than 1. Now to take this discussion one step further, those who advocate the 6 Sigma concept of quality management, they say that any process inherent and intrinsic to it is a drift. Any process is likely to drift towards the left or towards the right or keep swinging. The drift is natural to any repeated process. Now, in statistical language, if you were to talk about hypothesis testing and say, hey, listen, this was my process capability ratio as of yesterday, and today it seems to be, have drifted this much. Are the two populations really the same or different? The statistician will say, if the mean has not drifted more than 1.5 sigma on either side, that is, from the dead center 1.5 sigma to the left, or from the dead center 1.5 sigma to the right, as long as it is within this band, less than 1.5 sigma on either side, the totality being 3 sigma, the drift is not statistically significant. In other words, it's the same population. So hypothesis testing will show that it's the same. There is no real change between one distribution and the earlier distribution. So he says factor this into your original calculations. Remember to make your process so robust. Give it that buffer of 3 sigma drift build it into your design. In other words, your process capability ratio is upper specification limit minus lower specification limit, that is the distance between the rail. From there you take away 3 sigma. So upper specification limit minus lower specification limit minus 3 sigma divided by 6 sigma. So in other words, you have set your control limits internally, 1.5 sigma from the left side, 1.5 sigma from the right side. You have given that away as not relevant, and you want to now treat this as the distance between the rails. So upper specification limit minus lower specification limit minus 3 sigma upon 6 sigma translates to upper specification limit minus lower specification limit divided by 6 sigma, that is your process capability ratio, minus 3 sigma upon 6 sigma, that is equal to 0.5. In other words, if your process capability ratio is, as per your estimates, 2, then because you took a sample and not the total population, there could be an error. So the error of estimation could be 10%. So you discount that 10%. So from 2, it becomes 1.8. And now the 6 sigma man tells you, from that 1.8, take away 0.5. So you're left with 1.3. He said that is your safe estimate of your process capability ratio on the ground. So even if your process drifts here or there, your product is not going to be affected. Your process is not going to be affected. Your quality is not going to be affected. No patient out there is going to be placed at risk. So, your process capability ratio as you have estimated it, less 10% because of the over-optimistic estimate that it could be, because it is based on a limited number of samples. It is only an estimate, 90% confidence. So, you say, whatever is the process capability ratio, discount 10%. Now whatever is left from that, you take away 0.5, and whatever is left now is your process capability ratio. So applying the same thing towards estimating what is your real process capability ratio. If your process is properly centered, then whatever is the process capability ratio, less 10% minus 0.5, that is your real process capability ratio residual. But if it is likely to have drifted towards the upper specification limit or lower specification limit, you have to first establish what is your real process capability ratio. That is upper specification limit minus mean divided by 3 sigma, or mean minus lower specification limit divided by 3 sigma, whichever is lower. From that you discount 10%. From that, because now you're talking about half, you discount not 0.5 but 0.25. So whatever is the real process capability ratio, whichever is the lower, less than 10%, minus 0.25, that will give you your actual real process capability ratio. Now before I close this discussion on process capability ratio and estimation of process capability, remember process capability ratio has a numerator and also has a denominator. In the numerator you have the distance between the rails, that is the upper specification limit minus the lower specification. And in the denominator, you have your standard deviation, which is an index of your process variability. The idea is to make the denominator as small as possible so that the process capability ratio is as high as possible. But if you want process capability ratio to be high, the numerator could be increased and the denominator left alone. Now that is wrong practice. That is totally unacceptable. But I'll give you an instance where this actually happened in one company, not in the pharmaceutical industry. They had an upper specification limit minus lower specification limit of 15 units. And no matter how hard they tried, their standard deviation was not going below 2. 6 times standard deviation was 12. So 15 divided by 12 left them with 1.25. In that company, it was a global corporate policy that no process shall be taken in for commercial manufacture unless the process capability ratio has been demonstrated to be 1.5 or more. So after trying very hard and they had a deadline to meet, the product had to be launched, and so these people fidgeted with the numerator rather than the denominator. So they expanded the distance between the rails, that is upper specification limit minus lower specification limit, they made that 20, and the denominator remained 12. So 20 divided by 12 gave them a process capability ratio much higher than 1.5. And they filed those documents and told their management that everything was all right and released it for commercial production. This is malpractice. This is abuse of process control and control of variability. This is just